Greetings, salutations, and welcome to this review of Fatally Flawed, The Quest to be Deepest by Verna van Schaik, which I may be mispronouncing, not sure. Whoa, look at that reflection. Cruel. Okay, so Fatally Flawed, The Quest to be Deepest is a fascinating story by Verna about how she came to win the Women's Deepest Diving award. She was the deepest diver, scuba at least, or what they call sport diving in this book, in 2004. She held that record. I don't believe she holds it anymore. The deepest dive records change quite fast. Anyhow, so this is her story about how she came to be a diver, how she came to be a deep diver, and in this case, a deep cave diver, and how she decided to go for this record. She won it for going down 221 meters in a cave dive in South Africa. She's South African. I think the name of the cave is Bushman. I can't be sure. It's South African. It's a bit different Australian. And Australian is different to just about any other form of English, so fair enough. Now, anyway, the story itself is very enjoyable, and I was startled and pleased and intrigued and involved. I really like the fact that the early similarities and differences between Verna's early diving experience and mine. So she started diving in the early 1990s. When she was at university in South Africa. I can't remember the name of the university. Something like that. And she started diving because she wanted to be a marine biologist. Now, coincidentally enough, in the early 1990s, I was at a university in Queensland in Australia studying to be a marine biologist, and both of us started diving for the scuba diving for the same reason, which is basically we wanted to see what was under there. We wanted to be part of the marine environment, and it sounds like both of us found a deep peace and enjoyment in that environment, seeing the life around us and all that sort of thing. I was highly entertained by the fact that both Verna and I had similarly bad issues with the dive club in the university we belong to, but that's where the differences accumulate. So apparently in South Africa, at this particular university, sea diving was expensive and difficult to do, but there was a lot of inland cave and possibly lake diving. Definitely cave diving, possibly lakes. And that apparently was cheaper. I, of course, was studying on the Great Barrier Reef. I'm not saying that sea diving was cheap and I was on a student budget, but it was right there and it was relatively easy. Verna also paints a picture of the early 90s where dive schools were fewer and far between compared to Australia, where Great Barrier Reef, they were pretty much everywhere. It was easy to go diving. It's far more regulated today than it was then, but it wasn't hard. And you could get quite a few sea dives in. She, however, went the other way. She was diving in these caves, and she says it was difficult to do added courses. There was the open water, and after that you just learnt from the club that you were involved in. Now, I'm going to assume that was a technical dive. Technical divers are divers who go deep, do caves, or do gas mixes and that sort of thing. And I'm guessing that many of these comments relate to the fact that she was going for technical diving, or maybe South Africa was a bit different, because in Australia there were plenty of courses, there was plenty of equipment, and there was plenty of information. You didn't have to be part of a dive club to keep diving, and you didn't have to be part of a dive club to keep doing courses. So that was quite interesting and different. If anyone watching this did actually experience Australia and South Africa in the early 90s, I'd be interested in what they had to say about that. So anyway, Verna started going deeper into the deep diving and the cave diving and the more technical diving, because that's essentially what her university club were doing. And for a while she was part of that, very much part of that. And there was a deep diving record holder in that group. I'm not sure I can pronounce his name either. Nuno, it looks like Nuno Gomez. and I believe he's a Portuguese speaker. So, yeah, anyway. There was this club and there was this culture, and she became part of it. And an interesting thread throughout this book is how it feels to be a woman diver. Now, I've read a couple of books by women divers, technical divers specifically, deep divers, cave divers, and in the technical diving industry, there seems to be this constant struggle, or at least there was in the 90s still, this constant struggle to be recognized as a diver even though you're female. And it seems to me like Verna van Schaik experienced that in spades. And as she was refused spots on dive trips, as she had to fight to go on dive trips, she became more and more determined to do that. And that, as well as personal insecurities, which she goes into a little bit in the book, helped build up her ego structure and her insistence that she was going to be a deep diver, and eventually decided to break the women's record, which I believe at that time was 210 or 211. I'm not sure. Anyway, so I do enjoy the way this book is written, by the way. It's very matter of fact. It's very much her story, her telling it, her description of her experience. There's nothing trying for heavy literature, and it's above all not trying for thrill and shivers up your spine or anything like that. It's her story of her life and her diving and experiences. So she reflects a lot on what draws people to deep diving, whether it's an ego thing, and a lot of that feeds into the construction of this book, which ends up in a very, very well-known sad event in the dive. So when Verna went in to do her record-breaking dive, which she succeeded in doing in 2004, part of her team were two other divers, technical divers, Dave Shaw, an Australian, and Don Shirley. I think his name was Don Shirley. Don Shirley was a South African, and he had a dive shop in the area, which is why people kept diving at this particular dive site, Bushman or whatever, which seems to be a very, very tricky spot to dive. I can't say I was ever tempted to see how far down I could go before I blew my eardrums to smithereens or bent into agony. But if I had, I think I would have chosen something a little bit more enjoyable to dive in, because this doesn't sound like an enjoyable dive site at all. Anyhow, I'm not a cave diver. I know lots of people who are cave divers and are fascinated and love it. In fact, there's a YouTube channel called Dive Talk. If you've made it nearly 10 minutes into this video and you're enjoying what I'm talking about and you haven't encountered Gus and Woody over on Dive Talk, you definitely should. And I'll try and link to a video in which they talk what happens at the end of this book. So, Verna had made her dive. She'd broken the record. They'd gone through certain ways to prove that she'd made the actual depth, because she was trying to break a record and the international community needed to know that. But the day after that, Dave Shaw and Don Shirley did another dive. This was going to be Dave Shaw's record-breaking dive. He was diving on a rebreather instead of on a gas mix. A rebreather is something very specific. Over in Dive Talk, they'll explain all about it if you want to know. In his quest to dive deepest on the rebreather in that cave, he came across the body of a diver who disappeared 10 years ago. Dion had I believe what had happened to him is he had blacked out and fallen to the bottom of this dive site. He was known to be there, but no one had found him before. Dave, in trying to break this record, located the body lying in silt. And this book talks about how he had had a dream, a premonition the night before that he would, and that he did indeed find this body. So, Dion Dreyer, that's it. So, after that dive, Dave decided that he was going to retrieve this body which he'd found. He felt a deep connection and a need to retrieve it, having located it himself. And recovering bodies of cave divers who've died and stayed in situ is a thing. It's a dangerous thing, but it's a thing that people do. And Dave Shaw actually rang the father of Dion, apparently, and said he was going to retrieve him. Originally, according to this book, Dave had intentions of diving almost immediately after the dive in which he discovered the body. But having received a certain amount of bends, he had to go to a chamber for a while, be straightened out, and they tried again in 2015. Now, this is where the later part of this book concentrates. On that dive, everyone who was going to be diving were rebreathers. And I guess I should say a word about that. Most people who scuba dive, like I do, sports diving as apparently they call it in America, in South Australia, South Africa, oh my God. Just laugh at me, I'm not going to clip that. Sports diving as an open water scuba, I'm actually a bit more advanced than that, but I like going shallow, I like water to be warm, I like to see ecology. I don't want darkness and cave walls, I just don't see the appeal. However, when I'm diving, I dive on an oxygen mix. A rebreather is different. It's an actual system whereby you breathe your same air over and over again. It gets filtered, the carbon dioxide is pulled out of it, and it's a tricky little mechanism because you need to learn to use it. You can't just put it on and breathe. You need to learn the pacing. You need to keep the air flowing. If it stops, it won't filter out the carbon dioxide. If you breathe too fast, you're breathing it before it can filter, so you're breathing in your own carbon dioxide and you will eventually pass out. There's a lot to it. Now, Verna discovered that the entire team that were going to retrieve Dion's body were all going to be on rebreathers, and that cut her out because, well, at the end of the book she says she's now learning rebreathers. At the time, she dived on tank air. And eventually they asked her to be there as the surface marshal for this dive in which Dave Shaw was going to retrieve Dion. It's an exciting story and a scary story and a brave story. And I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the matter-of-fact way in which it was told. I stress that the fact that Dave Shaw lost his life trying to retrieve another body doesn't necessarily reflect badly on him. It's a sport with dangers and issues, and even the most experienced person, when they're knocked, can make bad decisions. Like the smartest person can make decisions if they are drunk. Nitrogen narcosis has led to many bad decisions. So, with all of that, I'm going to say that this book won't be for everyone, and it's encountered some very harsh criticism. Of the people who've loved this book the most, as far as I can tell from reading online, are women who want to read about women divers. And it's easy. Jill Hernandez aside, the wonderful story of the Taylors aside, the majority of books about diving or involving diving are very male-centric. And toward the end of this, Verna vents a little bit about how hard it is to be a woman in one of these sports. I think that many people in the diving industry may find elements of this confrontational. She does at the end criticize some of the decisions made by Don Shirley, and I imagine that isn't going to sit well with many South Africans. He's apparently a big part of that industry. Now, Fatally Flawed does show some signs of having been self-published. It says it's published by Liquid Edge Publishing South Africa. I love having a bird. In 2008. But some of the reviews also talk about the fact that Verna is mentioned into Diving into Darkness by Philip Finch, in which he also describes that dive that David Shaw did in 2005. Apparently, Finch heavily criticises Verna's handling as surface marshal of the events. And both of these books were published around about the same time. So between that, some of the reviews, the fact that a large number of online sources that talk about Dave Shaw's attempt to recover the body, I would say that there's a lot of controversy and there's a certain amount of disagreement in opinions among the dive industry and divers who are technical divers. Don't know what it is. I'm thinking of reading Diving into Darkness next just to see what that side of it is. Now, the end of Fatally Flawed is Verna thinking about the experiences, but there's one last note for those who aren't familiar with the Dave Shaw story. It's not a happy ending, but it's as happy an ending as you're going to get when someone dies in the cave, because when the police divers went to retrieve the equipment that had left behind, the cords brought up Dave Shaw's body, but they also brought up DeAndrea's body. So in a strange sort of way, Dave succeeded in his attempt, if at the cost of his own life, which is sad. A lot of the discussion about how the diving was being managed after it was realized that Dave was at the bottom and wasn't coming back, but they were still fighting to retrieve Don Shirley at that point, when there was a very real chance that he wouldn't be able to make it. There were a lot of divers going in and out. There's a lot of dive choreography, and it's actually quite a fascinating story for anyone who's into that sort of thing, and even perhaps anyone who isn't. Anyhow, so I enjoyed this book. I don't think it'll be for everyone, but if you are into diving, I do recommend it. If you are a woman who's into diving, I even more recommend it, because I think you'll get a certain, especially if you're around about my age, I assume Verna's not too far off my age, you will get some sort of justification from some of your early experiences, I suspect. I would give Fatally Flawed, A Quest to Be Deepest, anywhere from the 3.5 to 4 star mark, I suspect. And yeah, very glad I read it. Might go on to Philip Finch. After reading this one, I might end up a bit annoyed by that though. So anyway, thank you for watching. Read good books.